Good evening, everyone. It's always nice to raise our voices on such an important event. I am so happy and glad to be moderating this panel. I believe I share a background with each and every one of you. I am from Uganda, and I'm happy to see my president. You're welcome. And I am an administrative assistant. I work at UMass in administration, and I have worked as a scheduler for the McCormack department. So Africana Studies was under my supervision. So I'm glad to see you. And I'm glad to see you, Professor John, from New York University, from Africana Studies as well. You're welcome, and I am honored to be your moderator today. I will start by asking all our panelists to introduce themselves and what they do.
I'm President Small. What I do, I'm retired. And that's what all people do, right? Formerly, I taught at the City University of New York, 20 years in the African Studies Department. Prior to that, I was an imam of Muslim Mosque. Prior to that, I was an activist in the streets of America. With a lot of the formation for the Liberation Army, Black Panther Party, and a few other formations. So that's my foundation. I'm an African, completely, no adjectives, and I'm not even clear. I live a life of freedom or death. Those are the only choices we have.
Thank you very much. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kyagulanyi Sentamo Mitembo. I was known as Bobi Wine. It's unfortunate that my music stage name has overtaken my real name. I'm a music artist. And as many of you know, in my generation and generations younger and older, musicians tend to take a nickname. So I took a nickname, Bobi Wine. Of course, later on I regretted I wish I took a more African sounding nickname. But never mind, you can call me Bobi Wine. I'm an activist. I don't want to call myself a politician, but I'm involved in politics. I've run twice for president in Uganda. I come from Uganda, a nation that got independence in 1962, but we have never had a peaceful transfer of power from one leader to another. That's a country of close to 50 million people, ruled by one military dictator called Yoweri Museveni, who has been in power for 40 years. He came in power when I was 4 years. He is still the president. This year, on the 15th of January, we had an election. I was the main contender, and I won the election. Unfortunately, the military took over, and I had to run out of the country. So I am living not as an exilee, but technically I'm in exile here in America and across the world. I continue to agitate for the freedom and unification of Africa, but most importantly, for the respect of human rights and democracy. I'm very honored to be here, ladies and gentlemen.
Good afternoon. My name is Tony Vandermeer, and I'm a professor in the Africana Studies Department over at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. I have to say, speaking of exile, I feel like I've been in Boston in exile from New York for almost since the drug war. But I also I was one of the first students in the Afro-American Studies Department right here at Northeastern University when it was founded in 1973. The Afro-American Institute was our home. It was something that was open, all night. Where we argued, we played games, we fight, we organized against the administration and around popular issues that was happening during the time. And so for me, I ended up going to UMass Boston, where I'm at now, fighting the good fight. And as we know, there's a war against Africana studies. In fact, that's part of the war against Black people, and so that's why we're here.
In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, I bear witness to the oneness of God, and I bear witness to the oneness of this prophetic community, from Abraham to Muhammad. I thank Almighty God, Allah, for raising up the most honorable Elijah Muhammad here in the wilderness of North America to teach Black people who were robbed of the knowledge of themselves back into the knowledge of themselves. I thank Allah for leaving with us my leader, teacher, and guide today, the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan. With their names, I greet you in peace. Assalamu alaikum. I'm Student Minister Randy Muhammad. I'm the Minister of Muhammad Mosque number 11, happy to serve the Nation of Islam and the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan. I'm also the founder of Torchlight Recovery, Inc. We run the only Black owned and operated recovery support center in the state of Massachusetts and Recovery Cafe. I just want to say that I'm honored to be on this panel with my esteemed brothers here. I'm humbled and looking forward to a beautiful conversation.
Thank you so much. And we can start. The first question is, can you please define Pan-Africanism? What does it include? Can you please define Pan-Africanism? What does it include?
My definition is very simple. It is a unification of African peoples worldwide. No question, again, no adjective, no qualification. The unification of nearly 2 billion people. Probably the largest nation on the earth. But because we are disunited, we appear to be the smallest nation on this earth. On the continent alone, there's 1.something billion people. And scattered across the Caribbean, Central South America, and the Americas. And with Asia, we have close to another billion diasporans. And we have failed to unite them around 3 elements: economics, politics, and culture. And I would add the 4th element, you call it spirituality, but I'd rather call it African sacred science, which you sometimes call religion. All people have at its core their concept of divinity, their concept of what makes them human, right? So that's what I call African sacred science. The economics, and that is the wealth in your environment. The politics, that's the management instrument for the wealth in your environment. And your culture, that is the socialization instrument for your environment. Those 4 elements should be the things that unite the African peoples worldwide into a one world nation of people. That I consider to be Pan-Africanism.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm inspired by that. Before I say anything, I'll request you to understand me, because I view things probably in a more pragmatic way, being that I come from the continent and I live on the continent in real time. For me, I will not look at it in an academic way. And other than defining, maybe I'll prefer to describe what I see or what I have come to know and understand as Pan-Africanism is precisely pro-Africanism. For Africa, looking out for Africa. But what Africanism? African weather, African resources, African minerals, or African people? It's diverse. Pan-Africanism, in my view, is supposed to be pro-African people, the people to begin with, then everything else comes in. Unfortunately, I must also mention that while we sing Pan-Africanism, this is the most abused term by us, but not for us. Pan-Africanism started out as a beautiful thing by our forefathers, the Osajefo Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Patrice Lumumba, and all those. These were our forefathers that fought for independence. And I believe there was a time when they stood like we are standing today, when they gathered in these numerous cities, planning to go back. And indeed, they went back and pushed what was realistic Pan-Africanism, then to liberate Africa and ensure that Africa achieves self-determination. Unfortunately, over the time, it has changed again and again and again. My baptism name is Robert. I was named after Robert Mugabe. He was a great Pan-Africanist. He was a great revolutionary. But by the time he passed away, I did not want to call myself Robert. And that is why I prefer calling myself Bobi, because he had relegated the same. So many people have turned into that, including our own Yoweri Museveni, who was a great revolutionary, who spoke magic when he was my age. So Pan-Africanism today makes very little sense. Why? I mean, look at exactly what's happening in South Africa today, which is supposed to be the base of Pan-Africanism, which is the anchor, which is the collection of all our collective African effort. In every single African country, Pan-Africanism was a sounding vowel. It was the word, it was the chant, while Africans were putting efforts together to go and liberate South Africa. Today, the black man is a foreigner, not only in South Africa, but everywhere else. I'm here in exile. I'm supposed to be in exile in Kenya or Zambia or Tanzania, but I cannot hide myself in Kenya because the dictator in Uganda is in perfect collaboration with a new incoming dictator in Kenya or Tanzania. So for an African man like me, the safest place is thousands of miles away in a land which is supposed to be an imperialistic land. So maybe, and I'm speaking for my generation, maybe this generation needs to find new terms that we will respect, that we will honor, and we live by. Nevertheless, Pan-Africanism is supposed to be for Africa, by Africa, pro-Africa. Thank you very much.
I want to remind you of something that Malcolm X once said. He said, if you take a puppy and you put it in the oven, it's not a biscuit. And so if you take an African out of Africa, they're not Negroes, right? They're not, anything else but African. And so I'm gonna stand on this. I'm probably more African than some other folk who's African, right? In fact, I represent one of the horrors that was perpetrated on Africa. The fact that I'm a descendant of the Ma'afa, the Middle Passage, in terms of the, made into chattel slavery, and separated, and disconnected, from Africa, and the fact that we had to fight to remain, to be the people who we were as Africans, and who created the ideas that's also centered around Pan-Africanism is very important, around that, and supported liberation movements around the world. We got to remember that this is the imperialist state. America is the imperialist state, right? And so you got to be very careful, about that. And so, and to your point, is that why is it that in other countries are not giving you exile, right? It's because the imperialist state is not allowing. It's the same thing why when the U.S. can blockade Venezuela, or remove the president, blockade Cuba, and tell everybody, if you do anything, we're going to jack you up too. You understand? So we got to understand, that, and I'm going to be straight. Like when you're in exile, right, you got to be careful here. Malcolm was here. What happened to him? Dr. King was here. What happened to him? Right. You understand? Right. There wasn't some lone gunman that was behind that. Right. So, Pan-Africanism is about how we see the importance and the centrality of Africa and one Africa, right? How do we deal with divisions that we have? Who created those divisions in Africa, you know? And the point is that we gotta recognize who our enemy is. What is the principal contradiction and not the secondary contradictions? And what happens to African people, we're running on the secondary contradiction. We refuse to see who the real enemy is in this country. I want to add this other point that Brother Smalls raised. I want to add to the point is that the other part is military. If we cannot defend the ideas that we have, they're not worth having. I'm going to say it one more time. If we can't defend the ideas that we have, they're not worth having. And we got to be willing, you know, I don't want to go off because I'm about to, but we have to be willing, right, not only to live what we believe, but also to die for what we believe in. Because the imperialist state has a lot of money, and they will put it before you like they put drugs before us before. And people will take that and forget about their own relevance. That's how we got here. You understand? So Pan-Africanism is about us. It's not only repatriation, it's rematriation. You know, for us to go back to that spiritual center that our ancestors had of us, right? Versus falling for the okie doke. And I'm gonna stop there.
When I think about that question, what comes to my mind is one of the lessons that we were given in the Nation of Islam by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He asked the question, why does the devil call our people African? And the answer is because he wants our people, our poor people of America, to think that the people in Africa are the only people that they have. And he wants us to believe that we are all different, right? When we think about that reality, when I look at Pan-Africanism, the key is African, right? It's not Pan-Africanism. So it's not necessarily just the land, but it's the people. And so we can't get caught up in a name, because as, you know, humbled to be here with Professor Smalls, I looked at all your scholarship on hidden colors, and part of what a lot of those documentaries revealed is that Black people are universal, right? And the term Africa is a newly coined phrase. The continent went by many other names, Kyagulanyi, or Egypt, or other names that were known. And so, but push it further than that, we are a global people. So one of the other things that we're taught in the Nation of Islam, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad asks, who is the original man? And he says that the original man is the Asiatic Black man, the maker, the owner, and the cream of the planet Earth. But in that context, he's showing us that when he says Asiatic, he's not talking about the continent Asia, but he says that at one point, the whole planet was known as Asia. So you have Asia Minor, right? You have the Near East, the Far East what? The Middle East what? Right? And so the whole planet was once called Asia. And we, Black people, are the original people that came with this planet. And so we are indigenous to the entire planet. Right. And even if we look at the concept of the original people and the root of civilization being in Africa, but we took that original civilization and established cultures all over the planet. So this is why you can look at in Asia and there's pyramids. You can look in the Americas and there's pyramids. There's all of these great remnants of ancient civilizations that go beyond the current understanding of history that we're given in this Eurocentric society. So we are a global people. Now, when we come back to Pan-Africanism, is the idea that the people, Black people, the original people, right? Pan-Africanism, that we have to be for Africa, for the land, and that the land should be for the people. That we are the original people, and that we should come together collectively to benefit from the wealth, the resources of Africa, right? And that we, the Africans or Black people who are from the diaspora, have to make a connection back to the motherland, and that the motherland has to make a connection with the Africans throughout the diaspora or the original people, and pull our resources in unity so that we can all profit and benefit from those resources together. So that's what I believe it is.
Media and cultural diplomacy play in strengthening global African identity.
That's education, media, and culture.
Education, media, and cultural diplomacy.
Well, the first thing is to inform. You know, I have a phrase that's called history erases the mystery. History erases the mystery. If you don't know history, you're confused in someone else's mystery. And that's where most of us are. Each one of the brothers were given a piece of history, and Baba just gave a heavy piece of history. When we're talking about Pan-Africanism, and we're talking about the word education, then every educational system in Africa and in every African community in Central, South America, North America, and Asia must be disbanded and thrown out. How can you educate a person by denying the ancestral experience of the person? Appropriate education is to be informed and instructed by the experiences of your ancestors. We are now being instructed and informed by the experiences of the genociders of our ancestors. And because it gives us some money, and because we can play the little technical games on how much technology we have, we become a part of the continuation of the genocide, both physiologically and spiritually, of the African peoples. And there's nothing you can do. You can't argue with that. That's the reality. You can't say we got rid of colonialism, but every curriculum on the continent of Africa was set up by the colonialists. Here in America, the curricula that the African community have to swallow was set up by the enslavers and the genocide. Slavery and genocide, let's make no, we say slavery like it was a work program. Slavery was genocide that lasted for centuries. No other people in the world had to endure a process of genocide for centuries. Not even for decades, but we endured it for centuries, and we don't call it genocide. And if you don't call it genocide, you're really not explaining to yourself the experience of your ancestors. True education is to be instructed and informed by the experiences of your ancestors as they encountered the world. And that's not what we're getting. Second part of that, true freedom that comes from true education, you have to be shackled to the identity of your ancestors. If you're not shackled to the identity of your ancestors through that informing of the experiences, you're not being educated. And the second part about media, which is a tool for sharing information. Really, and I'm not playing on the nation because, you know, I was taught by Malcolm was taught by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, so I'm up in it. Truly, right now, the only true media we have that is truly an African informative media in North America is the Final Call. Yep. And it used to be Muhammad Speaks. And we miss it because we don't understand what media is supposed to do. Media is supposed to inform you accurately of your condition through analysis of history, economic, politics, and culture. And there's only one or two at best but primarily one that I know that does that. And what was that third piece that you mentioned?
Cultural diplomacy. Cultural diplomacy.
Cultural diplomacy. Girl, that is a big one. You know, culture, most of us don't even know what culture is. We think it's dancing and music and stuff. That's not culture. Dancing is not culture. Music is not culture. The kind of dress you wear, that's not culture. Those are tools of culture. Culture is the idea that those things are trying to project. The principles, concepts, and ideas that those tools teach and project. What are the principles, concepts, and ideas of the people that is the origin of humanity? And we don't have to play with it or soften it, okay? When the cosmos, when the universe decided, and this is to me well, because I really think I'm a good priest, and I am a priest of African tradition at a very high level, and I love it and I enjoy it. When the universe decided to be human, the universe became an African woman. Mitochondria, DNA proved that to be the only fact of genesis of humanity, right? Now, if we understand that, and then we go to culture to cultivate, that's where the word comes from. What are we cultivating? Because it is culture that should protect our people from genocide. And if you're not practicing your culture, you can't protect yourself from genocide. What is culture? Culture is all the things that people do to survive as a group, from the food you eat to the language you speak, is all designed for your survival. And if you allow that to get distorted, your chances of survival gets distorted. He was talking about Museveni, who's been there. He needs to rest. He needs to step down. There's a time, like I'm going into 81 years. So I stepped down from every organization I was in because there's a time, no matter how much I think I know, there's a point where you cannot give birth. You cannot generate. And so you let the youth come to do that. What you do is instruct and inform the youth so they know the past. And that's the role of culture. Culture is one of the most powerful instruments or weapons we have, but we play with it. We dance to it. But we don't say, what is the principle? What is the ethical, moral foundation that we're trying to sing in a song or show in a dance? When the young ladies were dancing the other one, coming down the aisle today, we saw nice dancing and it was all beautiful. But what was the story they were telling? The necklaces around, like, I'll take mine. I won't go to the camera. I think we had all these beads, they're pretty beads, right? But when we came to this hemisphere and it took away all of the physical things we had to remember how to remember the concept, ideas, and principles. So this, Babaluaye, you know what this bead means? Oh, people say, oh, Babaluaye is about diseases. No, the medical craft, and how they retain the medical craft was to create ideas around this colored beads. So anyone know if I'm wearing this beads, I'm talking about the medicine that destroys communicable diseases. And that group of brothers and sisters who say, I'm the priest of Babaluaye, they're studying secretly on this. We talk about this one. And we talking about at the crossroads. We talking about psychology. This is the African school of psychology. We use this bead and this color to secretly retain the mystery of the art and craft of how to deal with psychology. This is one of the most important ones. People love to say, oh, that's Ogun. Ogun is a war. Ogun is the god of iron. That's the mythical interpretation. Ogun is transformation of the human spirit. And iron is only used as a symbol of transformation as a process. Because you take a stone that's full of impurities and you put that stone in fire and you burn out the impurities and you come up with steel. Through transformation, you've created appropriate tools to be used to create civilization. So when we took these beads, it looks like beads and they people worshiping beads. No, each of these represent an African school of thought in our philosophical system. And so culture is essential to get back to in terms of understanding what is African culture. And African culture is the culture of God itself. It is the culture of universal perfection itself. It is not a belief in nothing. The African culture is about the knowing we created the divinity. And the divinity, and I'll end with this because it's important, because you can't separate culture from your divinity. You see, we created the divinity to explain ourselves to ourselves. That's simple. If something is, how do you say, supreme, omnipotent, and all of these big terms, then nothing else can exist but it. So if only it can exist, what the heck are we? It's an aspect of that existence. Every cell in your body can reproduce you. Do you realize that? They call it cloning, right? I can take a cell from the arm, I can reproduce you, one from the butt, just in your perfection. Well, every cell in the body of the divinity can reproduce it. So each one of us contain all of the possibilities of the divinity itself. I know the nation said we were God the flesh, but else God is. But African culture is so key to this concept of Pan-Africanism, because I have to come back to it, because I understand Bobi's frustration, but I may come down to Uganda and help you out. I've been going back and forth in Uganda many years. I'm there with Idi. I was there when Museveni first came to power. I was there during Obote. And we see the mistakes made, but we can't confuse the mistakes that's made in our efforts to try to deal with compromising and all of these things dealing with the West without taking into context the role of imperialism. And imperialism isn't a phrase. It's a group of bankers down on Wall Street, okay? Imperialism sits in Washington, D.C. Imperialism sits here in Boston. I lived here for many years before moving back to New York. Imperialism is about the control of the resources of the earth for the few. And they will do any form of genocide to do that. When you see what's happening on that continent, even in South Africa, and right here in America, Foundation of Black Americans, if you do not understand how the system manipulates thought through media, then you won't understand what's going on in South Africa. That's not xenophobia going on in South Africa. That's called British intelligence, Mossad intelligence, CIA intelligence, putting their operative in the field. But you can roll a snowball down the hill. You just have to start with one little tiny snowball. And then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And if you put some money into people's hands and they can articulate concepts and ideas, before you know it, the ignorant in our community who is emotionally suppressed, economically suppressed, will jump onto anything to try to find salvation. And it's happening right here in America among us. People saying, we're not Africans. We are from America. We are indigenous. I go to a reservation every other year and celebrate part of my family lineage, but I don't say I'm Indian. And those on the reservation, I have to chastise them for not saying they're Africans. But you got to be clear on lineage. And lineage leads back to Africa. It doesn't matter who you are. Even if you're from Scandinavia, if you want to get it right. So when we talk about culture, culture is the educational system of a people that allows them to be instructed and informed by their ancestors' experiences on the earth to determine what to do next in order for me to survive. So that's enough, and then we could go on some more.
But before we talk about what role should education play, I think it's important to look at what role it has and is playing. Then we can decide what it should play. We cannot see where we're going unless we see where we're coming from. I'll start with the role education. I'll start with education. What role education has played in shaping African identity. I think education, or rather miseducation, has played quite a major role. In my view, negative. And you will understand I'm speaking as a 44-year-old, born in 1982, and inheriting the effects of colonialism and neocolonialism, and born into an education system that is meant to channel me and the entire generation into a certain perception. See, we have an education, and actually in Africa, that is teaching us to be servants. An education that has taught us to believe that we are not enough. I don't know how it is in Ghana or in other countries, but until high school, we are taught about the Canadian prairies, we're taught about the traffic jam in New York City, we're taught about the history of America as far as 500, 1,000 years ago, but not talked about the history of Africa just 200 or 300 years ago, over time of land that has been deliberate. That is why you find, unlike in Japan or in China, an African youth leaving school, but learning so much about far away other than Africa. I think that has played a detrimental role, and in order for that education to play a role, it should be centered for self-improvement and focusing on pragmatism, using what we are, focusing on who we are to transform ourselves. It goes further, because most of the education institutions, schools, and tertiary institutions have been religious-based. They're either Catholic schools or Muslim schools and all that. And we must understand, with all due respect to our religions, that religion was a major tool in the colonization of the African mind. And therefore, it is teaching us that we are not enough. It is to teach us that I must have a name Robert, and it must be my first name, and my African name must come next, and so on and on and on and on. That's why I believe that the major thing to do in our education system is to re-educate the next generation, to make sure while we learn, there's a huge effort to unlearn what has not worked and to relearn what has been taught wrongly and differently. That's my view. That should focus on our health, how to develop and purify our own health system and medicines. From where I stand, I have a grandmother that never went to school, but could look after pregnant women and deliver them, that knew the healing of most ailments and sicknesses. Unfortunately, that has been deliberately fought with our education, to the extent that the modern pharmaceuticals have actually pushed it down the minds and throats of our people that our traditional medicines are bad. Unfortunately, many of them, we've lost them, and it has not benefited us. But this begins and falls with leadership, because our leaders know. But the policies have always been influenced from the West. While we blame the West, I think we have to take the blame, because in our case in Uganda, we got independence 64 years ago. 64 years is enough for us to shape our own way, if at all we want to shape our own way. So the education, in my view, should be focusing on, when I was running for president, our education was focusing on 4 major channels. That is the academics, yes, the arts, the athletics, and agriculture. In my view, that education alone will be able to transform, because we don't only look at being doctors and engineers, but we need to understand that we as African people, our bodies are blessed with that ability. How about we understand and study the science of abilities so we can own the arts and the athletics way, like it has been in the history that has been rubbed away from us. That is my view about our education. Our education, in order to shape our African identity, it has to be shaped in Africa, with African values and with an African agenda, not teaching, not maintaining the colonial education. 64 years later, in many other countries like Ghana, you got independence way before us. But you will notice that our education still has elements of colonial education. Now, coming to media, the same way, because our media is largely controlled. The content seems many times to want to channel or to want to associate or assimilate with the West. That is what we, in many ways, define as fashionable and as cool. So that media also needs to be Afrocentric. I'm glad that Africans of today have social media, and we've been able to reshape the content with a little bit more African identity. I believe that is going to revolutionize our media other than centrally controlled media, which we have. The culture, I'm in agreement with Professor. I'm a student of culture. My first graduation was in music, dance, and drama. And just like Professor mentioned, these are just expressions of who we are, which is expressed in our music, in our folklore, in our dance, and in our storytelling. But ultimately, that culture has to be also Afrocentric, develop the confidence to own who we are, to embrace who we are, to love who we are, especially our languages. It's unfortunate that our languages are not so far-reaching, because due to colonialism, we were largely divided, and you cannot very easily connect all of Africa with one language. Well, there's Swahili in the eastern part of Africa where I come from, but we find that our culture is transmitted in the English language, which is in many ways to the detriment. But owning back our culture and re-Africanizing it, I believe is what's going to help shape it in the African direction. I thank you.
So essentially, culture is how we do our thing, right? But, you know, the question of education and media and culture, it's all connected, because we have to ask, well, what is education? What is culture? You know, what is media? And so the real issue is that we are, you know, victims of cultural imperialism. You know, because the culture that we tend to manufacture is the culture of the people who dominate the world, and it's the idea. So in many ways, culture is ideological, because culture represents those ideas. And so are we working in the ideas, you know, of ourselves, our ancestors, right? You know, what Brother Smalls was demonstrating when he was showing you his elections. And he was saying that this comes out of a school of thought that was philosophical in nature. It was the education, the indigenous education of people, and the symbols and the icons that they use to educate themselves and pass on that knowledge. Many times when it was, you know, more indigenous and oral in terms of how we learn through apprentice models, right? So I'm not going to poo-poo, you know, the system, but it's who's in control of the system, whose ideas are being manufactured in that system, the same with culture. You know, part of our problem is because of culture, when you look at the images they portray, how they portrayed Africa, how they portrayed Black people, you know, as being less than, and white supremacy being more than, and so forth. That's a product of culture. That's a product of media. That's a product of education. Malcolm X had raised this question a long time ago. He said, who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your head to the soles of your feet? Right? And so we've internalized that and we passed that on. I mean, look at the programs that we have on TV that some black folks own, right? When are they really giving us the kind of education, and issues about Africa, in terms of the origins of civilization? One of the things that I've been struggling with at the University of Massachusetts is that during the pandemic, we put forth that the university should become an anti-racist health promoting university, and that they need to in order for anybody to graduate from UMass, that they had to take an introduction to Africana studies. And we said, we quoted Diop. He said that if Africans never left the continent, the world would never have been populated. Right? If Africans never left the world, so then how is it that people do not know that the parents of civilization is African people? So if you hate African people, you hate yourself. Right? And so when we look at the way that, white supremacy and racism is being employed, right, it minimizes Africa, right, and African people. So that what we say in Africa is that in order for anybody to graduate, they have to be re-educated. Now, the problem is that we have to re-educate some of the professors who are in Africana studies and black studies as well. Right, because some of them come in various disciplines, and versus from Africana studies or black studies, and then they go into these departments and still don't understand the centrality of Africa, right? So there's a lot of work that we have to do. So education plays a very important role, but for who? Right? And same thing with culture. And so one of the things is that we have to begin to respect the indigenous knowledge that comes from our ancestors. We throw it away, right? And we make it hocus pocus and magic and witchcraft. And I'm going to be clear. When that brother showed that film here last night, and you had, the priest doing something and the whole trouble, is that, you got to be careful with the images and the symbols that you project, right? Because then people get miseducated about what traditional African belief was about, what spirituality was about, what those kind of rituals were about. They were about healing in many cases. They were about knowledge transference in other cases. They were about passing on the lessons of the past so that we could have the insight into the present and the future. Right? Well, we take it and we dismiss it, and we believe the knowledge and the education that somebody else has taught us based on their ability to control and dominate us. Right? And so with media, we are part of the media. When we leave here, people ask, what'd you do? Where'd you go? Well, I went and we talked about Africa. We talked about this, we talked about that. Versus we talked about something that's completely irrelevant about our existence, right? So we have to learn, how do we spread the word? How we promote the word, right? How do we begin to control? This is what Marcus Garvey was about in terms of setting up a press, right? And talking about the centrality of Africa. Where's our press other than the nation, of the final call, right? Where's our international press? How do we know what's going on internationally? When somebody tells us something, can we believe it? Especially with AI, especially with Donald Trump in office. He lies to us every day. Right? And the media let it slide, right? So we have to think about, how do we educate our children? We have to think about the culture, the way we do our thing. Now, that doesn't mean that the way we do our thing is positive, because people do their things in the negative. We have to look at a more positive, revolutionary aspect of how we understand culture versus the reactionary aspect of culture, the kind of culture imperialism that Assad Shakur had talked about.
Thank you. This question is very important, and very near and dear to me. I'll say, to answer the question, what role should education, media, and culture and diplomacy play? A central one, right? A very important one. The Bible says, my people are destroyed from a lack of knowledge, right? And that is a reality that exist among us as a people. I can speak to this question as a black man in America who came up in this system. We're taught in the nation, one of the things you gotta understand is that we as a people have been totally destroyed. We've been robbed of our names, our language, our culture, the knowledge of our God, our history, and our identity, right? And being ignorant was the primary ingredient in making a slave. They had to rob us of the knowledge of ourselves to make us to think that we were less than who we really are, right? And so our condition right now is a direct result of us not having a proper knowledge of self. So now when we look at these roles, education, media, and culture, very important. But the question then becomes, what education, right? And so the problem is, and I think my brother Bobi, your name, Bobi, was alluding to earlier, if we have the colonizer's education, then it don't matter how much education we have. And this is the misnomer. A lot of us, we're taught, go to school, get an education. But if you're just being educated in the colonizer's educational system, he designed the education to make us a better tool for himself. And so we need the proper education. And that proper education, we have to have a thorough knowledge of ourselves that's not rooted in what the slave master developed and gave to us. So we have to control our own schools. We have to control not just the school, but the curriculum. We have plenty of scholars, right? Black scholars that we can develop our own history books and curriculum and teachers to teach people not what the colonizer or the slave master has given us. And we have a tendency to think that if we go, even, folks look at these Ivy League colleges, and they assume that you got a better education if you went to an Ivy League school, because these are schools that are celebrated by elite white people. So I want to go to Harvard, or I want to go to one of these elite schools. But that education wasn't really designed to liberate black minds. And it's not really, that education is rooted in white supremacy and the promotion of white supremacy. So if you have black people being educated in a white supremacist education, then we wonder why, after 58 years, we're still in the same condition. So education has to play a very vital role, but the question is, what education? Where are you getting your education from? We have to go back to a historical root knowledge and not glorify these so-called universities because they're prestigious universities, but they're not going to teach you what you need to know from a brother like Vandermeer. Now, if you go to these schools and you go to his classes and brothers like him, then you can get some of that knowledge. But again, I don't think they have you in Harvard or Yale, right? So education is very important. They don't even want them in UMass, right? So education is important. We got to control the education. Now, the other two, as far as media, is very important in culture because they play hand in hand. So now, when I think about media, one of the things that we deal with is we talk about social media. So now media has become a tool of education. There's a lot of people that get their information from social media, whether that's Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, or other social media platforms, even YouTube, right? But the problem with that, most of those platforms are not controlled by us. Right. And so, there's a monetization. And unfortunately, what we see is a degenerate subculture that is being promoted and that get likes and shares and views, all kind of ratchetness. People fighting, women fighting, right? All kind of degenerate things. So, but by the same token that negativity can be promoted through media, social media, right? And so when we talk about social media, that's one aspect of it. We can turn that around and start to promote a positive culture, promote knowledge sharing, information sharing, right? And then we talk about the mainstream media as well. Now, culture, this is the part that's really near and dear to me, because our experience as Black people in America, we have a problem where our culture has been hijacked. I'm a product of the hip hop generation, proud to say that. And in truth, hip hop led me to the Nation of Islam, because in the late 80s and 90s, hip hop culture was conscious. So the rappers were talking about Africa. They were wearing red, black, and green. They were talking about Malcolm X, right? And it was from a rapper that I first heard the name Farrakhan. And I was a gangster in the street. I wasn't a church going. I grew up in this messed up situation. But it was through hip hop that I was into, where I heard the name Farrakhan, and it drew my curiosity to listen to him. And when I listened to him, I had a spiritual awakening. And it led me on the trajectory and the path that I'm in now, right? One of my favorite rappers back then was KRS-One. His name is literally an acronym that means knowledge reigns supreme over nearly everyone. They were promoting the idea that knowledge reigns supreme. Now, why am I saying that? Because fast forward, though hip hop culture started conscious and positive, it was hijacked intentionally. And so now, those that own the record companies, I'm not talking about the top rappers, right? Whatever rapper you think is the top artist or whatnot, they are on a record label that's owned by rich, old white men that own the labels. At a certain point, they've seen the power that culture had, because young Black youth were becoming militant. They were becoming educated. Remember, we were wearing X hats, X medallions, right? They flipped it and they began to support a subculture, what I describe as a genocidal, self-destructive culture, which promotes drug dealing, drug selling, being a gangster, being a thug, and for the women, it promotes being a woman that sells sex, who's a stripper, and so forth. Right now, one of the summer anthem is a young lady who's promoting scamming and boosting, and people think this is cute. But they have weaponized the culture, right, to promote this degenerate behavior, really to criminalize us. And so culture is very important. I stand here as a witness and testimony on the effectiveness of when culture and the media is used appropriately, how it can be a tool of liberation and education. So in closing, all of these play a vital role. But again, we have to control the media. We have to control the education. If we don't own and control the sources of the media, the information, and the culture, then we're going to be subjected to the oppressor who owns these mediums and is going to continue to dangle a few dollars. To a certain degree, I can't be mad at the rappers, because when you're coming up in poverty in the ghetto with nothing in the projects, right? You could, if you have good guidance, you could be guided and go to school, but most of us don't. So most of the leaders that we look up to is the drug dealers, the gangsters, right? That's real. If you're coming from a broken family, I can tell you my story. And so if that's the option that I had, I could be a gangster, I could be a drug dealer, right? Now look at the rappers. They can either sell drugs or they can rap about selling drugs, right? And if they can get more money rapping about selling drugs than actually selling drugs, to them, that's a better option, right? But the problem is the record labels that manipulate the poverty that our people are in, that would celebrate and promote these folks to promote crime. So, I mean, literally over the airwaves, over the radio, if you turn on the mainstream media, you're gonna hear a young woman who's glorifying scamming and boosting, which is crime. Or you're gonna hear rappers that are glorifying being drug dealers and thugs. In what society is it okay to publicly celebrate and promote criminal behavior? This is done in our community as a tool of re-enslavement, because when the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment was instituted, there was a clause that slavery had been abolished except if you have committed a crime. And so the goal has always been to turn us into criminals to justify our enslavement. And they're using the media, the education, and the culture to reach that objective.
Thank you so much. To add to this question, I wanted to say that we all undermine the role of the art industry, that's film and music, in their determination on education and the improvement of our identity. The film industry is one way that has a faster way of re-educating our society of who we are, how strong we are, how important and powerful we are to the society, and how we can redevelop, build trust between continental Africans, African immigrants, and African Americans.
The most practical steps they can take is to abolish the borders of the continent of Africa. Now, short of removing what the Europeans did in the Berlin Conference, because we didn't put those borders there. And here we are fighting over them. We have killed millions of our people over some artificial construct the Europeans put in place when they wanted to steal our continent. If they can't do that, and I know they're not willing to do that, because then you can't be Mussolini, you can't have a kingdom. So I don't want to get angry at me when I come to Uganda next month, but the next most practical thing they can do, and I think they're beginning to do that across the continent, is abolish the need for a visa to move from one nation to the other. That is one of the things that can be done. Many of the nations are doing that now. And so that is a good steps. When it comes to the diaspora, there's two diaspora, and we confuse it sometimes and sometimes deliberately. There's the modern diaspora that has voluntarily left Africa for economic reasons primarily. Then there is the old diaspora who was brought here as prisoners of war, for which I'm a part of. And we make up just in North America 50 to 60 million people, which makes us the fourth largest African nation in the world in terms of national boundaries. The African Union created a verbal concept called the Sixth Region. They've never implemented it. The Sixth Region as a singular region cannot cover administratively Central South America, North America, Europe, and Asia. That's too big. They need to create a 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th region that covers each of these regions. There should be a region for the Caribbean.
Yes.
There should be one for South America. There should be one for North America, and there should be one for Europe. That would make practical sense because that's governable, that's manageable. The 6th region was done because they knew they couldn't implement it because they don't want to implement it, right? And so even in my home country, Ghana, what the president did when he came to the United Nations was wonderful. But we've been fighting the reparations movement since the 1800s. nonstop. What they did in Ghana a few weeks ago around reparations was wonderful, but there was not a single African American represented when we are a body of more than 60 million people, all right, in our own peculiar national institution. And secondly, many of the nations of the continent have the tendency to come among us and the people, not the Caribbean, because the Caribbean have nation states to govern them. But the Black people in Central, South America, North America, we don't have a nation state. We're a national African population. And so they come and they pick our leaders. Let us pick our leaders. Let us tell you who sits on the councils. Don't tell us. Don't pick somebody from the Black caucus. They don't represent us. Right? Don't pick Reverend Sharpton and the lawyer. They're not into Pan-Africanism or nationalism or freedom fighting. And then because they're popular in America, have these people represent us. There have to be a sense of recognition of the diaspora as being real. We are real African people. We've been fighting a war for 500 years, nonstop, every day. And in North America, we're the only African population that had to grow up in a majority white state. Haiti is a majority Black country. Jamaica is a majority Black country. Barbados is a majority Black country. This is a majority white country. And we had to fight the most powerful white state in the history of the world to maintain our African integrity, and people don't want to recognize us. Now that has to be reckoned with throughout the states of the continent, because not one have appropriately recognized the 50, 60 plus million Africans in this precipice called North America, the United States. If they could do those things, recognize us as an African nation, that's something the nation's been calling for from its inception, and no African country has done it to this day, not a single one, because they're afraid of white America. We live here and we fight this devil, we're not afraid of it, so why would you be afraid of it, right? Secondly, get rid of passports for moving, get one continental passport, one African Union passport, for the entire 53 units in the process of going towards dissolving those 53 borders, which we know can't happen right now. And the last piece, and then I'll set up. If we can't move into a United States of Africa, and the African Union have the ability to vote this in tomorrow and act on it, we already have an Eastern Bloc region. We already have an ECOWAS in the West. We already have the South. That legitimize those three regions as three legitimate African states that comes under the purview of a union of some sort over the three, and dissolve all of the borders within those three contexts. That would be the biggest step towards having a singular nation some way down the line. I'll be long gone before that, but that should be the goal.
Thank you very much, Professor. The amazing words that you mentioned, Professor, sound like a heavenly dream to me. How I wish they were practical, because what you're talking about is right. Unfortunately, some of us that live at the continent in real time are faced with a stark difference between the ideal and the real. I definitely agree with all the ideas here. But one great man, one great writer from Nigeria called Chinua Achebe was asked in the 1980s what Africa's problem was. And he said, Africa's problem are not the rivers or the lakes or the mirrors. Africa's problem is leadership. Even our own Yoweri Museveni, he wrote a book called What is Africa's Problem? And he's quoted famously to have said in 1986 that Africa's problem in general, and Uganda where I come from in particular, are the leaders that overstay power. So we all should agree that it all begins and ends with leadership. Leadership is the difference between these beautiful ideas and the real catastrophe and the real tragedy that we meet. It should not be rocket science for Africans to build trust. We have been through too much not to have trust for one another, but to see. And I give it as an example that a wonderful country like South Africa, which is supposed to be the most landed country, has chosen to be the embodiment of self-hate. Not just the people, I repeat, not just the people, but the leadership too. Where you see the president calling self-hating Africans that are standing against their fellow brothers and sisters just because of their skin color. And we endorse them with a presidential meeting asserting that it is all right for us to carry ourselves in such a way. It is leadership. This belief, or there's an idea, and you've talked about the federating, organizations, East African Community, this ECOWAS, and all these. They're beautiful ideas, but I had to mention that these are reduced to only presidential clubs. If we must bring Africa together, it is not the leaders. These federations must not be political, they should be social to begin with, bringing people together, not bringing leaders together. Because leaders use them just to look out for each other's power and to consolidate each other's stay in power. Otherwise, almost 70 years later, why are we still divided by these borderlines? As an artist, I could only reduce this in a little a cappella and say, it was not our choice in 1884 in Berlin when them sit up on the table in the scramble and petition for African land. Right now we're living by the borderlines. It would be easier if I never had to get a visa to see my little sister in Tunisia or Namibia. But look here, 142 years later, we are still living by the borderlines. And why can't we see its divide and rule? Why do we act like colonial tools? The African unity becoming a reality. We should abolish the borderlines, like Professor said. But that will not come as a miracle. Deliberate steps will have to be taken, and that all goes back to leadership. While our current leaders are throwing around the word Pan-Africanism as a playing card, they don't believe in what they say. Or at least their actions don't represent that, because in the case of Uganda, General Museveni receives up to $1 billion every year in military support and all that from the United States. Why then would he have policies that empower Africans? So it is with leadership. These steps must be taken by the people to assert themselves and hold leaders accountable and ensure that leaders drive Africa into a direction that they want. Other than that, I want to believe that each president wants to keep their own enclave. One that has Kenya will keep their Kenya alone. One that has Uganda, Zimbabwe, Ghana, each one will want to keep their own enclave alone so they can control their own people. These, in my view, are only farm managers. It's just a continuation of neocolonialism. I'm sorry to mention or to be too blunt. Thank you.
You are right. but I want to add a caveat to it because my area of study is around leadership and change. And I always say it's about misleadership. And leader and leadership are different. And even though in leadership studies, there's no real unified definition of leadership, but one that I usually work with is taking initiative on behalf of shared values. That's leadership. And so it's not, particular, anybody could initiate leadership. Our mothers demonstrate leadership because they take initiative on behalf of shared values every day. You understand? But to your point, it is that divide and conquer is based on colonialism. You understand? And so this is why mass movements are important. So, it is through mass movement that things are going to change. It's not there's some individual who could be swayed by $1 billion, in the country and so forth, that we have to look at it. So I think that, so trust is based on the kind of relationships that we have and the things that the work that we actually do. And, I think that part of it, particularly around those in the diaspora, those African Americans, right, is where the curriculum in Africa, and I don't know, I just want to know because I haven't seen it, where there's in the curriculum, in the schools, they teach about the Ma'afa, they teach about how we got to the diaspora, how we got to the Americas, right? And who is, lighting that candle for us to come back, right? And talking about that, and because this is how you begin to bridge the gap. But as a brother Rodney said, excuse me, is that if if we are looking at who is in fact the ones who are teaching us and providing the cultural framework for us, and we expect them to liberate us. That's not happening. So they've been choosing to lead us for us. This is the exact point that's happening in Cuba today, right? It's like we want a regime change, and we will hurt your children. We'll let them die. We won't let them have any oil or electricity until, the leadership change. So they're not worried about the people. They're worried about who they can put there to say, well, these are the business transactions we want to make or we want to do, and you can benefit. That's not in Cuba. That's in Africa. That's been in Africa. What happened to Patrice Lumumba? Right? What happened to the African leaders who have been assassinated? And what will happen if we don't protect those who are standing up on principle and demonstrating leadership based on the needs of the people and taking, initiative on behalf of shared values? So trust goes a long way in terms of how we begin to educate people about the divide, about the history of what's happening and how Africa has gotten to the point that it's gotten to. Because even here, everybody in this room, have an important role to play in sort of addressing the misleadership and misunderstanding they have about themselves and our responsibility. Because ultimately, it's our responsibility in terms of what we do. But we make decisions because we end up being collaborators with the same system that oppresses us because we scared. We scared. Right? We addicted like a dope fiend to the privileges that they give us, right? And it was really to challenge them, right? And there was a saying, I think the last poet said, blessed are those who struggle, for oppression is worse than the grave. It is better to die for a noble cause than live and die a slave, right? We ain't ready to go that far. And until we're ready to go that far, that's when we're going to really have some real Pan-Africanism, right? You understand? Because there has to be a consequences, because when the people in power realize that they could bleed and die too, they're going to think differently. Now, that don't mean, don't get me wrong, right? We got to be careful, because these folks is armed to the teeth. They're armed to the teeth because they use education, culture, media to do their job, right? Right? So we gotta be careful and sophisticated, right? But we gotta be ready to answer the call, because the truth of the matter is that as bad as we think things are now, they're not as bad as it's been. And the truth is that before it gets better, it's gotta get worse, so that we become convinced that these folks ain't playing.
So I don't think I'm gonna be as long-winded on this one. I think my brother answered the question well. I'll just say two things. First is decolonization, right? I think to build trust, it's hard for Africans in the diaspora. And then particularly, again, I gotta speak from my perspective. We as Black people in America haven't been destroyed. However, we also have received divine revelation in the form of the message of the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who gave us and brought us into a knowledge of ourselves, right? When you were speaking earlier and you was talking about the schools, but they can't be the Christian school or the Muslim school or religious school. That'd be a fact-based school, right? I agree 100% because religion has been used and has been weaponized against us as well. Out of the experience of the Nation of Islam, we were given a theology that's independent of the slave master. We're not coming from the theology. We didn't learn religion from the white man's theology school, and we didn't learn Islam from the Islamic scholars of the East either. We were given a teaching that really centers us as Black people, as members of the original people, right? And so again, as I said earlier, we are taught that the Black man and woman are the original people of the planet Earth. The makers, the owners, the cream of the planet Earth, and God of the universe. Now that's a deep spiritual teaching that centers us in us. Now, for those of us that come up under that, now we have a heavy sense of self, rooted in Blackness, all the way to God. God is the Black man, right? So now, if we're building relationship with African continents, or African countries, excuse me, but the country still has a colonized mind, right? Still promoting the colonizers' religious views, educational views. Then, when we turn on the TV and see African nations wearing white wigs, right? You gotta wear a white wig to show that you are official. You still gotta imitate the oppressor, the slave master, the colonizer. It's hard to trust, right? And so that colonized mind produces self-hate. So one of the things that we deal with over here that a lot of Black Americans are dealing with, and it contributes to what you spoke about earlier, Professor Smalls, about this backlash of Black Americans who are shedding their African identity, right? Part of what's behind that is the feeling that oftentimes our African family that come here with a colonized mind look down on Black people that are here, right? Look down as though the Black Americans are less than, right? And don't respect, what you was talking about earlier, Professor, as far as coming up in this as a victim of the Ma'afa. When you were talking about, Professor Smalls, being an African nation centered in a white dominated society and still we rise and still we fight, And still we produce culture. But oftentimes, Black Americans are not respected. And I think that that goes toward a colonized mind. So I think decolonization, dealing with the education, the religious views, and then another thing that I think would help build that is opening the borders. But what I do see that some African nations are doing now, which is offering dual citizenship. If we recognize that Black people in America are African, then we should be offered dual citizenship in every country in Africa. Because guess what? I don't know what country my ancestors came from. We were robbed, so I don't know which one it was. So we should open that up and allow for Black people in America to go back to Africa and have access without, and be treated as citizens and be welcomed back. I think these are practical steps that will go a long way to building that trust. But it starts with decolonization of the mind, because Black people in America, yeah, we were enslaved, we were brought over here, we were robbed, we were kidnapped. But on the mainland and the continent, you were colonized, right? Your leaders were killed. And then they put schools in there, and they began to educate us and give us their values and their mind state, which is the same thing that happened over here. So we're kind of in the same boat. We were brought kidnapped, we were brought over here, robbed of the knowledge of ourselves, but on the mainland, they took over the land, colonized it, and instituted their system. We got to throw off their mind state, and then we can come together to the table as brothers and sisters.
Thank you so much. Can you give a big hand clap for the presenters? It was such an honor to serve on this panel with you. I won't ask the last two questions because your presentations enabled answers to the last two questions. So I'll pass over the microphone to the Q&A from the audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, honorable panelists, for sharing such amazing knowledge with all of us. I have a question. I think all of you have spoken to why, and it is important for our brothers back home and our brothers in the diaspora to find a way to work together. I am an elected person. I am also from Ghana, and I find myself in a lot of spaces where there is a lot of power, but there is also a lot of conflict between African immigrants and our brothers who are African sisters who are African Americans. Specifically, there are two groups in this country. One is African American descendants of slaves, ADOS. The other one is foundational Black Americans. There are some of us in the field in the space that I'm talking about that are trying to do exactly what you are talking about. Bring all of us together. What can we do to connect the motherland with those of us who are not just here in the US, but globally? But then we are facing strong opposition from members of ADOS and members of, how do we call it, FBA, Foundational Black Americans. I have a lot of respect for some of the positions that they are taking. African Americans sacrifice a lot. For me, from Ghana to come here and run for office in one of the most whitest states in the country, Maine, right? And get re-elected over and over, not because there are a lot of African immigrants there, but because when I came to this country, I collected and learned from my African American brothers and sisters. And I kept speaking to, showing my gratitude for what they did for me to be here, but also pushing back on policies that collectively is harming our people. So I'm going to ask all of you to share what you think we can do to honor the positions that ADOS and FBA are taking, and also create an opportunity to have an honest and respectable conversation with them. I've tried all the skills that I have, it's not working. Maybe you can help me tonight. Thank you.
I mean, I think we're going to get that first, because unfortunately, ADS and Foundational Black Americans who've been attacking me a lot, but nobody really attacked me. Maybe my children decades ago, I began to use the concept of formerly enslaved Africans in America in order to define us in a context where people would respect and recognize that we had a distinct culture, we had a distinct tradition, we had a distinct political reality and a distinct worldview. Because most people see us as just being a blend of a whiteness and not as a distinct. When you come from Jamaica, even though Jamaica, the blacks in America, in Jamaica came from Africa, just like the blacks in America. When you come from Jamaica to America, you're Jamaican. The blacks in the United States of America, no one recognized us as having an identity. Right. Let me say that again, because that's the crux of the problem of it. We have a national identity, we have an ethnic identity, we have a historical identity, and other brothers and sisters from around the world only see us as an addendum to white people. That's not what we are. We have waged a race war deliberately for 500 years. No other group have been engaged in an overt war day by day, losing thousands of people a year, and we still are losing them at the hands of the enemy, and most people don't even see our death. They see the prisons as being full of criminals, not being full of prisoners of war. Okay, and so we have a question, and I don't agree. Here's my disagreement with ADS and with Foundation of Black Americans is not to understand Pan-Africanism, the attack on Pan-Africanism, the attack on brothers and sisters from the Caribbean and from the continent. I understand their self-defense, but that is evil, that is wrong, and I've attacked that internationally. But for the African American population to want to declare a distinct identity, just like the Ghanaian in a false state called Ghana has a national identity. The Ga within that state has an ethnic identity. We too want to have our national and our ethnic identity recognized. And we haven't done a good job of doing it. And so others don't know how to deal with us, except that we Black Americans, which is just a different color of white America. And that's not who we are, you know. I grew up on a plantation in the South. I'm from the Carolinas, where we have our own Creole language. The Gullah Geechee language that's run all along the coast through the Gulf of Mexico into Louisiana, and not a single African community from the Caribbean, Central South America, or the continent will respect that we have a Creole. We're the only African in the diaspora who people have said, you lost everything. All right? Nobody tells the people in Trinidad you lost everything. Nobody tells the people in Haiti you lost everything. Nobody tells the people in Jamaica you lost everything. People, we respect the Jamaican Creole. We respect the Creole, the Haitian people, but no one respects the Creole, the African Americans. We are laughed at by even our own people speaking bad English. We don't know how to know English grammar, because we are the only people in North America that speak English using an African grammar structure. And that's why our children can't pass English in America, not because they're crazy. We speak English. Even me now talking to you, I'm not using an English grammar structure. And even I'm not going to change my Creole words and change the African words and words. Most of us still, 90% of us speak English. We sound like we speak the same English as white people, but we don't mean the same thing. And that alone has been a problem for us, and we don't quite understand it. The identity of the African American as a distinct African group. We're not just some dark-skinned white people. We are a distinct African group. We have as much of a distinct culture as any African group. We have as much of a distinct history. If I was to line up all of the warriors, male and female, died resisting just in the last 200 years, it will amaze you. It wasn't just Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey and Gabriel Prosser and Harriet Tubman. There was about 100 more. As much as my brother wear Marcus Garvey on his sleeve, Marcus Garvey didn't come here to a vacuum. Marcus Garvey came here because Booker T. Washington, who none of us have mentioned today, and I must mention him, was a great Pan-Africanist. Long before there was a Pan-African conference, he had a conference of the African world at Tuskegee. And people came from Malawi, Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa to that conference before Garvey made his first trip here. Matter of fact, they sent a delegation from Jamaica of 10 people who went back and told Garvey about this conference. And Garvey and Booker T. Washington became good friends. It was Booker T. Washington that invited Garvey to bring his program to America. But Booker was murdered. And you don't even know that. You think he died. Not a single one of you. Just let me see real quick. Where did Booker Washington die? One person. Tell me. Raise your hand. He died on a train after having been poisoned in New York on the way back to Tuskegee so he can die in his hometown. But he didn't make it to Tuskegee. He died when the train got in Baltimore. They assassinated him because they didn't want him and Garvey to hook up. Garvey would get here months later. And Garvey told, Tony Martin writes about this, where Garvey says, I've come to implement the Tuskegee model. And you got the Tuskegee model as the UNIA. If you can understand, Garvey understood African Americans. That's why he could lead us. He wasn't leading Jamaicans. All those 25,000 people in Madison Square Garden that he brought together, that was my people, because we understood him, because he understood us and respected us as a people. And that's why it grew. And that's the weakness now, that we don't know history. If we know history, we'll understand this contradiction and conflict that we have to work on. But it's the same with us. The African Americans, we don't know you from the continent. They never taught us about Africa in our books, in our schools. We were taught that even now you can ask the African child, what does an African city looks like? When I taught in the university, I could not get an African to draw me. Listen to me well. This was one of my tests. Draw just the framework of the map of Africa. It's a psychological thing. Not one African-American student could draw the framework. These are not adults, I'm talking college, could draw the framework of the map of Africa. When I asked them to show me a picture of one city, a metropolis, I got questions like, where did the plane land? When you go, Professor Small, where you land your plane? And I'm talking from adults, these were not babies. The miseducation is so prolific, but we don't pay attention to it. We don't know you. You don't know us. It is important we learn to study history so we can know ourselves and know one another. And that's at the crux of the problem. The average African American knows nothing about Africa, except that there's some brothers and sisters who speaks with an accent that they met on a job or they met in the school and he was from this or that African country. And if you ask him anything about that brother's country, his language, he doesn't know. Not because he doesn't want to know, somebody made sure he doesn't know. And they've done the same thing with you. I thought to bring a piece of paper that I have in my hotel room that the American government put forth in 1978, I think it was, laying out, and then Brzezinski would do it again when Carter was president. What the American government job was to make sure that the Africans on the continent and the Africans in the United States of America never come together economically, politically, and culture. And that is the international policy of the American foreign policy concerning us. That is still happening today. And if you think they're not influencing ADS, if you think they're not influencing Foundation of Black America, if you think they're not influencing what's happening in South Africa, the Mossad, the British intelligence, and then you're crazy. You don't understand.
that we are at war. They're clear. They need the minerals of Africa in order to survive. They're not willing to pay us our price for it reasonably. And so they decided to use psychological warfare, technical warfare, media warfare at its height. And that this self-hate thing, we thought we had killed self-hate 50 years ago. They have remanufactured self-hate among the African American and among the continental Africans. And when we come together in America, they know we can determine political policy in America because we can determine trade with Africa. They're not going to allow that. It's the policy of the government of the United States not to allow you to have a coalition with the African American. We can beat them if we know that's their intent. But if we think it's just us being confused, then we're confused. You understand? And so I know there's a lot of talking there, but we've got to be clear. This is not a benign neglect thing. Someone is at war with us because they want something we have. What we have is cobalt, coltan, tungsten, manganese, gold, diamond, etc., oil, and they want it because they need it to run their technocratic societies. They're not willing to sit. Do you remember Magufuli? Yes. The president of Tanzania, who went against the British, beat them in the World Court, made the British pay billions of dollars of what they stole in gold, took over the processing of gold, built some decent roads, some hospitals, and then all of a sudden he gets, what's the thing that disease? COVID. And he's gone. Thomas Sankara, everything that you see my young brothers in the Sahel doing, Thomas was talking and doing those things. 2 weeks before he was assassinated, he was at a conference somewhere in West Africa, the ECOWAS, and he was chastising them for coming in there wearing Italian suits and Italian shoes, and he was saying, my shoes is made in Burkina Faso, my suit is made in Burkina Faso, my unders is wearing in Burkina Faso. You know who gave the word for his assassination? Bobi Wine. The French would do nothing in the Francophone state without Bobi Wine of Ivory Coast saying yes. And when Ghana offered to try to get its army over to help him, Bobi Wine wouldn't let them cross his borders. Not that Ufuk was not also a victim of colonialism, imperialism, when we talk about that leadership. They're the leadership, but that leadership was trained and programmed by the same imperialists we're fighting against. And so here, between us and America, we gotta override it. That's why the question of Pan-Africanism is essential and important. Pan-Africanism's got to be the word, the way you spell love. Okay? I love you, I don't give a damn what you do to me if you're African, because I know why you do it. We would not exist. There would be no need for the Nation of Islam if there wasn't broken Africans. There would be no need for this conference except that there are broken Africans. Okay? There would be no need for me to devote 60-something years of my life instead of home taking care of my beautiful wife of 36 years and my children who've only seen me half of our marriage, if that much. I could have been at home, but instead, I exist because there's a troubled mind that is my brother and sister, and that is my children. And so we got to be clear about certain things and then I'll end. We've got to be clear about the fact that we are Africans, light-skinned, brown-skinned, short, tall, Malawian, South Carolinian, Brazilian. We are just one African. And when I see you, I see me and nothing else. And to get to that point, we've got to go back to our ancestors, back to our culture, back to our poorer society. We didn't have rites of passage, secret societies for nothing. We were socializing the minds of the next generation to lead. But we've abandoned them now. We don't know of the secret societies anymore. And we don't even understand the few that we have. I'm a Freemason, if you can call them free. None of us are free. I'm in Prince Hall. I love it. I enjoy Prince Hall. The attempt was to restore African integrity. I was telling somebody today, when you're in the Blue Lodge, and no one can speak again. I can speak anything I want from the lodge. When you're in the Blue Lodge, you got on your nice little suits, and you look like a nice European American. But when you hit the Red Lodge, you get a dashiki and a kufi. You don't wear them outside, so nobody knows. The whole thing is to take you back to African values, African principles, African interests. The whole history is about African people, but they keep that as the secret. And unless you subordinate yourself to them, they won't tell you that you are the model for which the best of them are trying to copy themselves. So understand the confusion, and let's love each other in spite of the contradiction. Then we can solve the problem. Because I'm going to love you whether you appreciate it or not, because I understand why you don't appreciate it. I'm going to protect myself from your destruction, but I'm going to love you anyway. And the brother, he was talking about the music industry. I have children who've been vice presidents of Sony. I have children who've been CEO of Amazon World Distribution and others well vetted. I talked to Tupac 2 days before he called, 2 days before he died. And what that boy got killed for is trying to take over distribution of rap music. Not for no rift between him and Biggie, because him and Biggie was in it together. And Biggie was killed for the same reason. And a few other rappers was killed also from the brothers down in Jersey, and who was a part of that. Teddy Riley had to give up Blackstreet. Y'all remember Blackstreet? No diggity? Okay. Well, you know why Blackstreet died? Because those old white Jews said, either you do rap music or we will not distribute one tape of yours. And so Teddy called a meeting of everybody, and I was at that meeting. And he told them we're going to take 1 year and we disband. Because they're not going to make us slaves. And so Blackstreet got destroyed because the same old people you were talking about. Tell them they would never distribute one of the tapes.